This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to week 4. Today we're going to be having a look at the second part of investigating system requirements. So looking at different techniques, looking at modelling models, and looking at documenting workflows with activity diagrams. But before so I'll just go through what I've got on the course website, as I'd like to keep doing each week, so you're familiar with what's happening. So the reading for today's lecture is basically chapter 2, which we covered last week. And I've also got a video on here about the UML activity diagram, which is part of the lecture. Also got a crossword here, similarly to what you did last week, going in, clicking and then selecting chapter 2, and then the crossword will come up for your revision activity. But what I want to go through today, before the lecture, is the assignment. Okay, I've released the individual assignment. Did you all get the email that I sent out saying that the specs were available? I sent it out this week. Okay, cool. I also posted it on the forum, but I thought I'd send the email out just to make sure that you've all received it. So 2 ways to get to the assignment specs. You can either click Essay Assessments, or you can click the Assessment tab. Okay, so by clicking Essay Assessments, it'll take you to that assessment tab either way. So we're on the Assessment tab now. Scroll down and you can see I've got the individual specs up here. I've got an individual rubric up here for you to have a look at. Underneath this link here, there is also actually a link to submit the assignment. Because I'm logged in as myself as a staff member, you can't see the link, but when you go onto the course website yourselves, there will be a link there to submit the assignment. So submissions are actually open, and I think the link appears when you log into your My Uni Essay to submit it as well. So there is a link there to submit your assignment when you're ready. Any questions you have, please submit them to the individual Q&A forum. I'm teaching several courses, and it's most likely that if you've got a question about the assignment, that probably you or 50 other people have got the same question. So I strongly suggest you don't email me directly. If you do, I'll probably say post it on the forum so everyone can benefit from the solution or from the response that I provide. Okay? And that way I'll also know what you're asking me about, rather than answering your question thinking that you're asking me about another assignment for another course I'm teaching. So let's have a look at the specs now. So it's an individual assignment, worth 15%, and it's due on Sunday the 10th of April. Assignments will be returned to you within 2 to 3 weeks of submission, and feedback will be provided via the rubric and an online rubric that I've made available on the course website. So basically, for the first assignment, we want you to think about improving your skills as a systems analyst and what they actually need to do given a set of circumstances to address. And it's basically all part of the systems analysis phase of the SDLC, i.e. the systems development life cycle. So in this particular assignment, you need to think about some information gathering techniques, as well as documenting workflows with activity diagrams, and we'll be basically covering that in today's lecture. So the rubric that I'm going to be looking at is on the course website, and I'll show it to you in a moment, but I'm pretty much looking for completeness, suitability and thoroughness of responses to the questions that I've asked. Okay? Keywords being completeness, suitability and thoroughness. Okay? Clarity of expression, adequate presentation and format, and correct spelling and grammar. Now, the word limit is not going to be checked for this assignment. It's 1,000 words equivalent, but you can't put a word limit on an activity diagram because it's a diagram. Okay? So it is what it is. Just do the task to your best ability, make it complete, correct, and you should be fine. The assignment must be submitted through Learn Online, so I won't accept any submissions directly to my email account. I think you've all had experience with that because I'm assuming this is not your first study period here. Is this anyone's first study period? Okay. I'm fine with it. But you're fine with it? Okay, good. I was going to say, welcome to Uni SA or welcome to the course. But yeah, if you've got any issues, I'm happy to help. So all through Learn Online, again, I think the links are available on the course website. So I want you to include as part of your submission one Word or PDF document containing the responses to the questions that we'll have a look at. Refer to your course outline for information regarding extensions and late submissions. What happens if you submit your assignment late? You get 0. Okay, I'm glad we've got that one clarified up front. Obviously things happen. If you need to ask for an extension, please submit your extension request through the link on the website, and I'll just show you where that is again so you know. But don't send me an extension request at 10 p.m. on Sunday the 10th of April because it's due at 11 p.m. I'm not going to be very accommodating. So requests for extensions well in advance with supporting documentation, or in advance as humanly practicably possible. So let's have a look at the questions. So first of all, got some information gathering techniques. I've given you a scenario of Schools for Life being a college, and they want to have basically a computerised alumni information system. Okay, so you'll see some of these. Well, you'll see question 1 and question 2 are exactly the same as one of the questions you have or haven't done yet in this week's tutorial. Okay, so if you've done the tute, the questions should look similar. If you haven't, which you'll have this afternoon, one of the questions is, who are the stakeholders? All right, so you need to think about who the stakeholders are for Schools of Life. And I've given you a tip on how to think about identifying all the interested stakeholders by looking at the 2 dimensions by which they vary. So we look at internal versus external stakeholders and operational versus executive stakeholders. Now, it gives you a great way of thinking about all the types of stakeholders that may interact with this different type of system. But I want you to also, in thinking of that, provide your response in the format given in figure 2.4 of the textbook and page 47. Okay? I'm pretty sure it was even one of the slides that we had in last week's lecture, where it gave you the grid of the different types of stakeholders, gave you some categorisations of external versus internal and operational versus executive, and it had stakeholder names within the grid. Okay, so I want you to present the information in that format to help you with the thinking and where these stakeholders would fit within that category. Not only that, for each stakeholder that you've identified in question 1, I want you to think about what aspects of the system are of particular interest to those stakeholders. So for each stakeholder, you can list those stakeholders, then have a hyphen or whatever, and then just specify which aspects of the system are of interest to them. So don't give me a whole long list. I want you to break the list down and associate it to each stakeholder. Okay? Next thing I want you to think about and do is design a questionnaire to learn how the current process works and what the information requirements for the new alumni information system would be. Because when we're gathering information, it's not necessarily all about what do you want. We need to figure out what is currently happening as well in some instances in order to move on and determine how to make changes and how to make improvements, okay, which is why I've tailored it that way. So what is the system currently doing? What are the current processes versus what are the new requirements? Now, I don't expect a 10-page questionnaire, so I've given you some restrictions and limitations on what you should include. In the textbook, they do mention 3 types of questions: closed-ended questions, opinion-type questions, and an explanation-type open-ended question. So there are examples of those types of questions in the book, and I'll show you a sample questionnaire from the book, how it's structured out in the book. So I want you to include 6 closed-ended questions, 5 opinion questions, and 1 question regarding or requesting the user provide you an explanation of a particular procedure or problem. And obviously apply the guidelines presented in the course and through your own research when designing your questionnaire. So you can simply go to Google, which is, our best friend at the moment because we can find anything, and look up, type in a search, guidelines for designing questionnaires. Okay, and you'll come up with a number of things. Okay, and different people have different aspects, but it's going to give you some great examples. You'll get some images, you can view the images, you can see how the questionnaires are set out. What do you need to have at the top? How do you structure your questions? Do you need to have instructions? How do you close off a questionnaire? How do you finish a questionnaire? What information do you provide in your instructions, in your header information, etc., etc.? What does an opinion type question look like and how can you structure that? Okay, so do a bit of research in terms of what is a closed-ended question, what is an open-ended question, to determine what they actually mean. Then think about the specific questions that are going to be relevant for this scenario. Last thing I want you to do, the second half of the assignment, is documenting workflows with activity diagrams. Question 4 needs you or asks you to think about modelling tools. So before we can document anything as a systems analyst, we need to have some tools and techniques behind us. In order to be able to do that, you need to know what tools exist. I could have said to everyone, go and use Microsoft Visio as a tool of what I want you to do, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to give you the option. Okay, there are a number of UML modelling tools available, and I quote UML in front of it. It's got to be a UML modelling tool to create UML diagrams. But I want you to think of it from 2 different aspects. I want you to pick one tool that is free and web-based, so anybody can use that UML modelling tool. The other tool must not be web-based, must not be free. It could have a trial period, but there must be some cost associated with it. Okay? Now, having said that, Microsoft Visio you can all get for free because you're students here, but you can consider Microsoft Visio as your not be free trial period and must have a cost associated with it. Just because you're getting it free, that's the benefit of a UniSA student. So you can choose Microsoft Visio as your second option. First option must be a tool that's free and web-based, so anyone can access it anywhere, anytime. All right, so do a bit of an investigation of 2 tools and then have a bit of a write-up on which would you use to represent the requirements for a new system and why, out of the 2 that you've identified or analysed, and justify your answer by comparing and contrasting the 2 tools you investigated. Okay, so that's part of what we have to do as systems analysts. How are we going to represent the information? What tools are available out there to us? You might not have a choice. You might have a choice. But it's a useful exercise. And lastly, I want you to develop an activity diagram using an appropriate modelling tool based on the following scenario, or the narrative which is probably close to my heart and lots of people's hearts, making chocolate cake with chocolate frosting. Okay, so I've given you a bit of a scenario there about what happens or what has to happen with this chocolate cake being made with chocolate frosting for someone's birthday. So I'll get you to have a read of that, or you can read it in your own time. But I want you to think about these things. Your diagram needs to include an appropriate level of detail and steps in order to address the following criteria. You need to use synchronization bars to represent activities that can be carried out in parallel. and you need to use decision nodes to represent decision activities that may be performed. You've probably got no idea what those things mean or are, but we'll have a look at them today if you haven't pre-prepared and read the lecture slides. I want you to also use swim lanes to represent the actors in the particular scenario, and there are a number of actors in that scenario. I also want you to place the following diagram on top of following label on top of the activity diagram, and identify which modelling tool you used to create your diagram. Now, the modelling tool that you use does not necessarily have to be one of the two tools that you investigated and compared and contrast. If you want to compare and contrast two tools, then use a different tool, that's fine. I'll say it up front and I'll say it now. Microsoft Word, Microsoft PowerPoint, any of those Microsoft, well, I shouldn't say any of those because Microsoft Visio is a Microsoft tool. Word, Excel, PowerPoint are not UML modelling tools. Okay, so don't use one of those tools to create your diagram, and don't use one of those tools as part of your evaluation. It has to be a UML modelling tool.
So does that mean we have to make a UML model out of this?
Means you have to create an activity diagram, okay, and an activity diagram is a UML model.
We couldn't just draw it, could we?
No, you've got to use a tool.
Oh, that's kind of shit.
Sorry?
Oh, I just thought that was kind of shit.
Why?
I prefer drawing.
But are you going to always draw things when you're doing them for your customers and clients and presenting them to perhaps a board of people?
Well, I'd like to.
You'd like to, I know, but part of the task is familiar with tools. So you can choose a free web-based tool. Doesn't have to take you long, but I'd like you to get into the practice of using a tool to create this particular diagram. It's your choice. And you're going to have to do it in your final assignment as well in your groups. Okay, because it's not going to be, there's going to be a number of tools that you're going to have to use, there's going to be a number of diagrams that you're going to have to create, and I'm not going to accept 15 or 600 hand-drawn diagrams. Okay, so it needs to be a Word document, and I don't want them all hand-drawn for this particular task, because that's part of the learning activity and the outcomes I want to achieve in this task. Okay? All right. Let's move on to the lecture. Does anyone have any other questions at this point in time?
Are we able to send you like a rough draft or anything?
It's probably best to ask questions of your tutor or in the tutorial, or maybe a specific question rather than sending me a draft, because I'm teaching like probably 200 students and it's feasibly and physically impossible to check drafts. So happy to address specific questions, but yeah, not drafts of the whole assignment and say, hey Kathy, can you tell me if this is good or not, or whatever. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions?
In our questions, so we have to include definitions.
Sorry, say that again?
In our answers, do we need to include definitions?
Not sure what you mean by definitions.
Stakeholder question, do we have to define stakeholders?
No.
Okay.
No. So just tell me who the stakeholders are.
Yeah,
okay? And I'll post, so for that particular one, you'll see I'm posting the solutions to the tutorials probably at the end of each week now rather than 2 weeks later. So when I post the solutions to this week's tutorial, you'll be able to see how it's been phrased, the question and the answer. So yeah, don't have to redefine what I've asked you unless I ask you for a definition. Okay? Any other questions? Okay. So a quick run through of the lecture. So basically it's extending or moving on from what we recapped last week in terms of the information gathering techniques. So you'll be more familiar with the different types of techniques that are out there. We'll look at the UML models that can be created, and we'll have a bit of a snapshot as to creating UML activity diagrams and using, in this particular instance, UML activity diagrams to model workflows. Okay? So we can conduct interviews with others, with users and stakeholders. We can distribute and collect questionnaires. We can review inputs, outputs and documentation. observe business processes by watching what people do in a given scenario, although there can be some pitfalls to that because people may change their behaviour in terms of how they work. We can look at existing vendor solutions and carry out some research, as well as collecting user comments and suggestions for the system. Now, in terms of interviewing users and other stakeholders, and again, it's mentioned in the textbook, there are certain things that we need to consider in terms of what types of questions we ask people, but you've got to be prepared as well for carrying out the interview. Okay, you don't just walk in with a blank look on your face, with no pen, no paper, and say, "Hi, how you going? Let's just have a general chat," because that's not going to go down too well, because you've got to be really aware of the fact that the people that you are interviewing are most likely really time poor, and they're giving up their time to spend it with you to provide you with some information that you require. Obviously, it's going to benefit them, but you're there to, carry out a specific task. So you want to be strategic about what you're doing, what information you're collecting, and determine, I guess, whether you're meeting with individuals or groups of users. So you need to figure out and determine and establish, I guess, A, who your stakeholders are, and then determine who you need to contact within an organisational structure, or whether someone that's outside the organisational structure, to figure out who's the best people to get your requirements from. You need to obviously obtain and discuss answers to the questions and document the answers and follow up as needed in future meetings or interviews. Why would you need to do a follow-up, do you think? Why would we need to do a follow-up of an interview?
Make sure that you're both on the same page with whatever you're doing.
Make sure that you're both on the same page with whatever you're doing. Yep. Why else would we maybe set up a follow-up interview? Yeah.
You can't cover everything in the same, in one interview. You can't cover every.
You might not cover everything in the same interview.
You might want to ask more detailed questions.
You might want to ask more detailed questions.
Once you have time to look at it.
Several groups of people and then discuss with other groups about other individuals.
It depends on what you find from those other groups. So you may meet with groups, then come back together and meet with other groups and meet with the same groups to reflect. Why else might you have a follow-up interview? Yeah?
There might be updates.
Yeah, there might be updates that you need to figure out.
Is it that you need different types of information you didn't think of at the start?
You might not have thought of something at the start, so follow it up. But also during the interview, they might ask you a question, or you might ask them a question, and either or might know the response to that question during the interview. So there might be something that either you have to follow up or that person has to follow up, so then you can come back to clarify the information. Okay? And that's basically represented as an open items list, which we'll cover in a minute. So we have an open items list to basically establish and determine what are the things that are still open and not resolved that we need to come back to and address in some form or another. But there are some themes that you can think about when gathering information. What are the business operations and processes? How should they be performed? And what information needs to be performed for those operations? So these are some very generic questions that you can think about as questions for the users. And they're open-ended questions because they're kind of asking you to provide, well, they're asking for a response that is not just a yes-no answer. So it's more of a qualitative response rather than a quantitative response. So here we've got a checklist for conducting an interview. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can see that we need to actually get done before we even do the interview. Okay, so preparation is paramount. Okay, you need to ensure that you've done all of these things to ensure success of the interview. Some things we need to do during the interview. Really important to have some things going on after the interview as well, to show that you've actually understood the requirements, review the notes, transfer the information, identify any ideas that need further clarification, which is what you're referring to. You may find something out that you didn't know about, or you may need to find something else out. To thank them. Okay, thanks for having the time, spending the time with me, etc., and follow up on open and unanswered questions. So here's a bit of an agenda for what you might want to set out during an interview. This is what that open items list looks like that I was referring to. So we have you can give it an ID. What is the issue title? When was it identified? When do you want to resolve that issue by? So when do you want to find out the answer to it? Who's responsible? Who's the contact? and any comments. Okay, so keeping a list of things you need to follow up. It's basically a to-do list of what you need to follow up and how you're going to follow up on that information, as well as when you're going to follow up that information by. So giving yourself some deadlines and timelines. This is the example of the questionnaire I was referring to. So here we've got some, I guess, heading information, you can probably call it. Some instructions in bold. We've got the open-ended questions. No. Closed-ended questions. I'll go back. Closed-ended. Because these are basically giving you responses that are going to have a number next to them, or a yes, no. Okay, so this is all quantitative information. How many phone calls do you receive? 15. How many phone calls are necessary? 20. How many times does a customer try to order? 50. So it's all numeric, okay? It's referred to as a closed-ended question. And these are the types of questions or examples that can maybe help you in structuring your particular questions in your assignment. Not to say that they're the same questions, but these are examples of closed-ended questions. These ones are the opinion type questions. Strongly agree, strongly disagree. There are different mechanisms you can use here to gauge or gather opinion. It doesn't necessarily have to say strongly agree or strongly disagree, so you can probably do some research and come up with different ways of representing those opinion type questions. But it's basically a sliding scale to elicit responses from users on particular scenarios. So the computer response time is slow and causes difficulties in responding to customer requests. Do you either strongly agree or do you strongly disagree? Notice here that there's some instruction on how to complete this particular section. Okay, so it's really good to have a purpose of the questionnaire, give some overall instructions of the questionnaire, but if you've got different categories and types of questions, it's also really useful and really important to provide a separate instruction for each of those sections within your questionnaire. So it's really intuitive, really clear, and really concise from a person's perspective that has to fill it out, that they don't read it and think, huh? How does this work? Or how do I answer that question? Or that's not really clear, or I don't understand, and they just throw it away or they don't even bother answering it. And that's one of the things that's going to lead you to success and a high response rate. If it's clear, concise, and instructions are there for the users to understand how to actually conduct the questionnaire. And again, the final comment here. So this is an example. As I said, there's plenty of examples out there. There's different ways to structure it, but this gives you a basic outline, and similar to the outline that I would like in the assignment, as I've given you the 3 types of questions that you need to address. When we review inputs, outputs and procedures, here's an example of a form. So they may have given you this form to show you this is the current procedure that we have, and you can maybe have a discussion or whatever to see what changes need to be made, or perhaps what's working versus what's not working. Okay, so looking at current procedures. Watch and learn. The way we document business processes after we've probably observed them is documenting them with an activity diagram. So if you ask someone, what do you do? They can either show you or they can explain it to you. In order for you to articulate that in terms of who does what and the flow and the sequence of the activities, you can document that workflow with an activity diagram. So as I said, there are different types of models that we can create and different types of modelling tools. So you'll have a think about the modelling tools by looking at the 2 tools I've asked you to in those particular categories. Then you'll create a model in the form of an activity diagram. And that's all to do with defining and describing requirements. And there's not one diagram that suits the whole modelling process. There are a number of different models that have a different purpose and a specific purpose. So it's not just one thing for the whole requirements. And they're basically used to communicate with the users and the designers. So there's multiple levels of communication that have to occur. So you've got to be clear and concise in what you're providing to the respective audience. So the model is the representation of some aspect of the system being built. Now, some examples of models. Textual model, so we write something down, for example, an event list. A graphical model, that's an example of an activity diagram. and there are also mathematical models. Now you'll get to do some textual models because you'll need to write some things down obviously in your assignment, but we'll also be looking at different types of graphical models, which are diagrams.
Is that a UML diagram?
That's a UML activity diagram, and that's what you'll be coming up with in your assignment. So UML model is the standard graphical modelling terminology used for information systems. All right, so it's a standard language, unified modelling language. Reasons for modelling: we learn about the process, reducing complexity by abstraction, remembering all the details, communicating obviously with lots of people, and a variety of users and stakeholders, and documenting what was done, more importantly as well, for future maintenance and enhancement. Okay, there's nothing more frustrating than having to fix something that's broken when you don't know what the initial problem or process was and it's not documented anywhere. So really important to have the appropriate level of documentation for the appropriate people that are going to be interacting with the system in some form or another. So here's some examples of the kinds of models that you will be creating and that we'll be looking at throughout this particular course. We're looking at event lists, we'll be creating use case diagrams, use case descriptions, class diagrams, and sequence diagrams, and state machine diagrams. You may be looking at these two, or probably the communication diagram, maybe with Wolfgang in systems design. Okay, but that's not one of the things we'll be looking at in systems analysis. So as you can see, there's quite a few things happening here. They all have a specific purpose, and they're all tailored to represent different bits of information for different appropriate stakeholders within a given scenario. So let's now have a look at documenting workflow with activity diagrams. So what's a workflow? It's a sequence of steps that we look at or carry out to conduct something. All right, a business transaction or to handle a customer request. So the activity diagram, what is it actually showing? It's showing either the user or the system activities. It also identifies which person or people carry out those activities, and it more importantly also shows the sequence of the flow of the activities. Okay, so several things that are being shown. It is useful for showing a graphical model of workflow, and it is an activity diagram is a UML diagram. I will quickly show this video. Apologies if you've already seen it, but because it's really short, I think it'll give you a really good context of what goes on in an activity diagram.
The activity diagram is a UML diagram. We saw a lot of UML diagrams in Chapter 1. An activity diagram is useful for showing workflows or business processes after carefully observing the work of end users. There's a swim lane for each diagram, several of them, with a heading at the top indicating who or what is carrying out activities. There's a pseudo-starting activity, there's an ending activity, and then there's a series of activities shown as flattened ovals. You can split activities with a synchronization bar, where there's a transition arrow coming in and it's split into two parallel activities. There's a couple of ways to show decisions. You can show a decision with a diamond, like you find in a program flowchart, or just simply as an activity where you make a decision. This is an example of an activity diagram used to show a workflow having to do with custom production orders. There are 5 swim lanes. As a salesperson, there's engineering, there's purchasing, there's production, and there's scheduling. It starts out with a pseudo-activity at the beginning, and there's a pseudo-activity to indicate the end. It starts with a salesperson, and their activity is to accept an order. And then from that, we cross over into engineering, where the order that's prepared by the salesperson is then used by engineering in order to carry out the activity make specification. And here we have a synchronization bar, where once the specification is made, purchasing can begin to buy materials, and production can begin to program the computer to allow running of the production. And then after both of those activities are completed, there's another synchronization bar that then allows scheduling to schedule actual production. And that's the end of the workflow. Now this is actually an example where we have pretty clear 5 different use cases that would be carried out as part of this workflow. And the use cases are spread across 5 different areas. We have an accept order use case, a make specifications use case, a buy materials use case, a program the production use case, and schedule production use case.
Okay, so quick introduction to activity diagrams. So you can see here we have, again, what's mentioned in the video, swim lanes, and they'll have the name of the stakeholder or the actor at the top of the swim lane. Every activity diagram has to have a starting activity. I forgot to show you the rubric for the assignment. Remind me to show you the rubric. Every activity diagram has to have an ending activity, and decisions can be shown 2 ways, and we have a synchronization bar. So in your assignment, you've been asked to show synchronization and you've been asked to show decisions when creating your activity diagram. So different ways we can use activity diagrams, different ways we can represent workflows, and again it just shows you different ways of showing certain things in activity diagrams. Now, using synchronization bars to represent a loop or a do-while loop, in the textbook they show you that you use it using a synchronization with a for each item on order and an end for each item. That's the viewpoint and the way these particular authors represent loops in activity diagrams. Other authors, other UML conventions in representing while loops don't actually show it this way. They actually have a diamond here, and then you're going back, then you have another diamond, and that kind of loops back. Okay, so we have a loop actually being shown with the use of diamonds. Again, if you want to see an example how to represent that, if you need to show a do-while loop, you can have a look on Google and say do-while loops in activity diagrams. So there's 2 different ways you can represent while loops in activity diagrams. One is this way, one is the other way. I'm not fussed in this point in time which convention and which representation you use, but it's just important for you to recognise and understand there are a couple of ways of doing that. So again, here's an example. Starting, ending, swim lanes, actors, a for loop, which again we could have a different way of showing that with a diamond and then that looping back up there. A decision node, synchronization bars. Okay, so the majority of these aspects you do need to demonstrate and show in your actual activity diagram for the assignment. Again, another example, we've got synchronization and then bringing it back into the final thing here. So different examples showing you different things with different actors. So I'll leave it at that, but now I want to show you the rubric for the assignment because I forgot to do that before. Does anyone have any questions at this point in time in what we've just covered? No? Okay. And also extensions. So if you need, so now we're going back to the assignment discussion. If you need to apply for an extension, this is the link that you click, extensions. Okay. In the assessment tab, you can see I've actually got the specs which we've gone through. This is the rubric here, which I've actually got on the desktop, so I'll open that up. So looking at the rubric, it gives you a guide as to what I'm looking for when marking your assignment. Okay, so you can see I've got a number of things going on here over a couple of pages. The assignment is out of 60 marks, but it's worth 15%, okay, of your course grade. So I've given you the weighting here so you can see how much each component is worth in this particular assessment piece. I've given you performance on this component will range from very poor to excellent. Hopefully you're all striving for the excellent column. I've also given you a list of the criteria that you need to address for each question. Okay, so question 1 is the stakeholders. This is what I'm looking for. Stakeholder interests. There are 3 components to the questionnaire that I'm looking at. I'm looking at the layout and the design. These are the things I expect in terms of layout and design. Closed-ended questions, opinion and explanation questions. Modelling tools. So question 4 is the modelling tools. Question 5, I've split the activity diagram up into 3 sections as well. So the layout and design of the activity diagram, the syntax of the diagram, and the level of detail that you have in the diagram. And that's worth 10 of the 60 marks. Your clarity of expression, presentation and format, and your spelling and grammar. Okay, so you can see this is what I'm looking for. So if you address each of these criteria to the best of your ability and go over and above and really do the work to address what I've got here, you're likely to end up in the high distinction column. Okay? If you want to do something a little bit less, or if you've missed out on a couple of things, you'll move into distinction territory. Average work will be your credit and your pass. If you miss out some of these things or don't bother doing them, you're obviously going to hit the poor and the very poor scale. Okay? So it gives you an indication of what I'm looking for, where the marks are associated, and hopefully gives you a good explanation of what I'm expecting for each component of the assignment. Does that make sense? So that's on the website. The one that you'll get back will just have some highlights in each section depending on where you get. I'm not going to obviously put all this wording in because it's already there, and you may get some individual comments in relation to each question depending on if there are things that we need to let you know of how you went versus how you didn't went. That's pretty much it. So any questions, post them on the website. Have a great Easter, everyone, and see you next week. If you haven't filled out